Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of the Current Review podcast. Today, we have on Brad Crist, and he is the co-founder and CEO of ChargeMate, which is a company that integrates artificial intelligence into the charging ecosystem. And I think this is really interesting because obviously both these sectors have pretty much blown up in the past 5 years. And this is going to be a really interesting conversation. So, Brad, could you walk us through what ChargeMate does and how it implements AI into the charging experience?
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrew and David, for having me on the podcast. I'm happy to be here. Before I get to that, I want to give you kind of a quick story. And I think the founding story is similar to what David's experience was. We both had taken delivery of a Rivian R1S. I'm out in earnest trying to impress my partner and friends driving this electric car. The first road trip we took, though, was met with a lot of friction trying to charge our vehicle. Because I'd worked in the charging industry previously at Volta as a product manager for the mobile app, I had an understanding that these systems don't all work well together. But here I am patiently downloading new apps, troubleshooting chargers, reporting damage. It was so much friction for my partner and friends who said, Brad, no offense, but this experience absolutely sucks. We'll be the last people to buy electric cars. You're going to have to force us with your mandates. Total backfire of my intended, impression of trying to impress. So, this problem nagged at me that the early adopters are patient to dealing with a lot of issues with what we call charging anxiety. But for the rest of the mainstream drivers, that's become the greatest hurdle to buying and driving a fully electric car. So when we started, we were initially thinking about how to help drivers find reliable charging. We actually pivoted to building a product that helps drivers at the physical station itself. We noticed that drivers' attention is in the car and routing, and then they're at the station. That's usually a foreign interface. The experience is really different depending on where you go, whether you plug in or check in, with the exception, of course, of Tesla, if you're charging within the Tesla ecosystem. And so ChargeMate is building an AI agent. You can think of our first product like a driver support bot. Drivers in our pilots would arrive at a station and it has a QR code that says need help, scan here. That opens then a white labeled web application that allows a driver to chat for support. So you see things like, how do I charge, or help me start a charge, down to really specific issues like, hey, the charging cord is stuck in my Chevy Bolt. I've tried everything. Can you get it unstuck? So our goal is to handle, any issue a driver faces and make sure that they can successfully charge. And that was inspired from a lot of the friction that we felt driving EVs and then dealing with a troubling experience with call centers and support.
Interesting. Now, I totally agree that is kind of an area that does really need some improvement, is the just user interfaces. And when you get to a charging station, because I think you pointed that out really well, is that it is this foreign interface that you haven't really been used to using. And it probably does create a little more stress or anxiety with someone when they're just presented with something totally new. So could you kind of walk us through with the, so you scan on your phone and then you'll get prompted with a two-way interface where you can message the support agent. So what are some of the common questions that you found from pilots on your program?
Yeah. So today you can scan a QR of one of our partner network customers. We're also integrating through their mobile applications, through SMS and text. So there's a few ways that you could activate the AI agent. In the driver-facing product, it looks like a web application and a chatbot. And the most common questions we get, about a third to half of the drivers are, I need help starting a charge. And from there, the bot will kind of get into the weeds of what actually is the issue. But it suggests that the vast majority of issues are more, user error or truly user interface and experience problems, not knowing if I should plug in first or if I need a mobile app to start a charge, occasionally friction with actually plugging in and a timeout. We also see issues around payment or authorization failure. And then the bot is going to use information from the driver as well as static information from the charging system and a knowledge base we're building of charger and vehicle information to help troubleshoot the problem, whether it's an issue on the charger or maybe an issue with the driver's car.
Interesting. Now, this is kind of more of a nerdy technical question, but I'm actually really curious because I used to work I had an internship at Lucid where I worked in charging validation. So I was working, basically reading all the data from the EVSC and the car. Um, so does this use like the ISO 15118 standard to be able to kind of get into the charger to read some of that data?
So we're not working with the ISO 15118 plugin charge directly. And in fact, we don't need integration to get started and begin resolving issues for drivers. That was why we chose the QR code, is that we didn't have to then be worried about integrations with the charging networks. That is an integration that we're working on, though, where we'd be able to read live status. So reading OCPP status or error codes. And let's say you see error code connector lock failure. Hey, Andrew, make sure you plug in until you hear a click. You might have to wiggle the handle on your Chevy Bolt to initiate the charge. That's kind of the intention of what we're building. And the next phase is to be bringing in OCPP data. 15.11.8 would be part of that, although that's in the future of our roadmap.
Cool.
How have you found people's responses to interacting with an AI agent? Because I know people tend to be pretty skeptical with AI bots in general, and especially in such like a stressful situation when you're calling to troubleshoot something. I can foresee a lot of people going right to zero, saying, "I want to talk to a human," which circumvents completely your system and what you're trying to enact and enable for these charging operators. So would love to hear your thoughts in terms of how that's been going and how you've been working through that hurdle in terms of human to bot trust.
Yeah, I love that question. And I'll tell you, I'm the biggest skeptical when it comes to charge chatbots, right? And kind of AI. Like, I'm the type of person on the phone that's like, human agent, talk to human. So I understand the frustrations drivers feel with AI and chat, and kind of the call tree type experience. I think the flip side of that is like, as long as the AI is effective and helpful and isn't constrained by just a few buttons that you're clicking, that people are willing to engage with it. So we went into our first pilot on around 80 stations with a global publicly traded CPO. And we were really concerned about, like, will people engage? Will they be willing to chat? We saw the engagement rate, like the number of conversations on a per station basis, 3 times higher than their call center. So it showed us that people were actually willing to engage when the alternative with the incumbent solution is calling a 1-800 number, often waiting on hold, going back and forth with, what location are you? Well, I'm at the Berkeley Stadium garage. Okay, let me look that up. Sorry, I don't see a location. What's your address? Gee, I don't know my address, opening Google Maps, right? Like the frustration folks felt, and even just having that call center experience once is enough of kind of the experience to say, I'd rather get some immediate help than, risk a longer call. I will say though, we have noticed that, some people will prefer to talk to a human agent, and that's great. But the fact that our solution is specific to the charger, as soon as they get on the call with the customer support team, they're already aware of the context, like what station you're at, anything you've already reported about what issue you're having. So we're trying to equip support teams to be more effective and see that chat is just one other channel to do that in addition to their typical phone line.
Nice. It'd be interesting. So you mentioned that a lot of these issues are sort of user error and they can be self-serve, but sometimes they aren't. I know in my experience, particularly with Electrify America, which tends to be the worst offender, um, you have to request a reboot. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. I actually find it surprisingly frustrating that um, I think that the support staff isn't enabled and given the proper tools to actually properly troubleshoot the error. Would you imagine that ChargeMate would be able to resolve that at some point without the need for human intervention and actually troubleshoot issues at the station?
Absolutely. That is very much our direction. So when the right error comes up and we are confident that that's solved with a remote restart, if we know certain conditions are met, go ahead and pass the remote restart commands. You're kind of taking over what a support agent would do, opening a charge point management system and being able to reset a charger. We want to be really careful about doing that because you don't want, to just be resetting a lot of chargers autonomously. But more often than not, when we talk to support teams and support leads, that is sort of what they default to. And there aren't that many levers that they have to really control and reset chargers, or they're manually creating work orders if something does look wrong. That's also something that we're doing today, of being able to pick up reports of damage or noticing something isn't resolved and being able to flag like a support ticket in their preferred support system.
Interesting. Now, this is kind of a like side note, but at least in terms of like automation and maybe diverting workforces, is I mean, there's so much to learn with electric cars that I would assume that it might take a lot of training just to equip anyone working at a call center to be able to solve any of these issues. Because it's like I just can't. I've learned so much in the past several years that I've been in this space for, but there's still so much I don't know, and I mean, it's mountains of information. It's totally radically rethinking the way we view automobiles so much with EV charging, that it probably would make sense for a lot of cases just to have the customer, if they're having an issue, first go to an AI chatbot that can know pretty much anything there is to know about electric car charging. So is this kind of the route that you see with customer support, at least in EV charging, is like first you go to the AI, and if the AI can't solve it, then you go to the human?
Yeah, it's interesting whether you view AI and kind of how that fits into customer support as the like low cost, low tier option. In our experience, it's actually more knowledgeable of the issues and errors, right? Because you can train the AI and equip a really robust knowledge base. To give you an example, some support teams have to deal with over 700 hardware specific error codes. That's way more than anyone could possibly be able to like handle. So while they're on the call, they're like, Google searching vehicle or charger specific issues, or they're opening spec sheets and trying to, control find for an error code that the driver told them was on the screen of the charger. Like, it's really tough. So we feel like AI is really well suited to that, whether that looks like a co-pilot for the agent on the phone or the driver facing component with like more of a chatbot type experience. We continue to think it'll be kind of a hybrid of options. So some drivers are like, I'm really frustrated, just get me to a human. And they want to feel relieved from that, talking to a human on the other line. Like, that's totally okay. But in the event that that's a hold time, or a driver would rather communicate and get a quick answer, that's also a good fit for our product.
Cool. Now, at least in terms of EV charging reliability, and we could kind of go down there, how have you noticed, have you seen things kind of look a little bit more brighter in terms of EV charging reliability and sessions being initiated successfully recently, as opposed to maybe in the past like 2-3 years? Because at least with some of the advent of some of the new charging networks out there, especially like Iona, I mean, I know they haven't expanded that quickly, but have you seen at least the EV charging reliability improve recently?
Yeah, definitely some improvements in reliability. And I think that's an important distinction to make, Andrew, is that the charging networks have done a great job of improving the operational uptime. How many days of the year is this charger online and able to charge vehicles? However, we haven't seen as much of an improvement in the actual charging success rate, or successful charge attempt rate, as California is calling it, or SCAR metric. And that speaks to a lot of issues that relate to driver experience, software, payment related problems, as well as hardware. So while the station might be online, that doesn't guarantee that people successfully charged at a charging speed and time that met their expectation and the capacity rated on the station. So I think that's where we see today in Europe about 1 in 5 charging attempts in public fail. In the US, it's more like 1 in 4. Now, reliability across the board is above 90%, but that refers to the stations are online. So there's kind of a delta there. And we believe the metric that really matters for profitability is charging success rate. That's just a little harder for a network operator to control. And so the first wave was, let's focus on, network uptime and get that above 95, 97%.
Man, 1 in 5 is still not that great. I'd be curious to see what Tesla is. I think
Yeah.
they're seen as the gold standard across the board. I would suspect that they're more like 1 in 20 or 30. something
Yeah,
like that.
you're exactly right. And I think the nuance here in the metrics is like, okay, I tried a charger, didn't work. I went to the one next door, or I tried again and it worked the second time, or on a second charger. Because Tesla typically installs, really large supercharging locations. We've seen that kind of behavior and talked to drivers who are like, well, didn't really matter. I just tried another one. Um, Not everyone is so patient. We still think, the success should be focused on, did you get a charge on your first try or second try if you're patient enough? Um, but yeah, that would be really good to see how that data varies by network and hardware. That is something that we're hoping to provide.
And at least in terms of, we could maybe shift this conversation a little more, but into just EV industry as a whole, kind of looking out towards like the next 5 years, especially with some of the recent events happening. In terms of charging, I mean, because this is more of your business, do you still see EV charging being a very expanding business, maybe with some of the new sentiment from the incoming administration, or what are your thoughts on that?
Great question. Hot topic right now. I joined this industry with a climate change mission, as did my founder. But we've learned pretty quickly that that isn't the marketing, point that wins with the majority of drivers. We need to talk about how EVs are more affordable, they're safer, they're comfortable and fun to drive. And they're all of those things. And they also don't have tailpipe emissions. But so there's definitely like some marketing improvements that the entire EV and charging industry could do. When it comes to kind of the headwinds, I think that the industry will face, and programs like NEVI or CFI that may go away, our perspective is that that forces charging network operators to be profitable earlier and not depend on, some of the government loans and grants that they previously had the luxury of working with. It's going to make site selection probably more specific and careful. And I think it will force and encourage innovations like ours, which are designed to improve the success rate or revenue and bring down the support and operating costs through automation.
I think it's interesting, given that I believe the intent, right, is to make America great again, and to make us globally competitive. But from what I'm seeing and hearing from a lot of people on a global scale, we are vastly behind when it comes to EVs. And it will require a huge amount of investment, maybe not directly in subsidizing the sales of EVs, but in all the stuff that comes before that in the value chain, right? The infrastructure and all this other stuff that I think, ironically, I think some of the policies that I'm hearing, like tariffs, like, like building in America first and oil and gas, I think actually makes us less competitive in the long run. But I mean, who knows? I am hopeful overall that EVs are just a better product, right? Like they are better as long as they can be affordable, and they will still need charging, right? That is something that you can't really outsource. I mean, the manufacturing of the EVs, they can be made in China or whatever. We buy a ton of stuff from China, but the charging itself, that's not something that you can necessarily outsource, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that sentiment a lot, David. I think that, the most affordable EVs are coming from China. That's good for the American consumer, but they're going to be slapped with a high tariff, and understandably for geopolitical reasons. But when it comes to charging, I think we're going to keep seeing more, multi-unit dwellings, workplace charging that is, the kind of park when the car sits idle overnight, or park while you're worked and charge. I think for the third of Americans who still, live in apartments without access to home charging, and they're completely dependent on the public, infrastructure available, that has to catch up. And I think I read in the last 3 or 4 years, like we've more than doubled the number of public charging ports, which is fantastic. But to go from 2 or 300,000 today to, over 1 million needed by 2030 is still a really long way to go.
Yeah. And I noticed too, at least because I was also living in the Bay over the summer, and there's so many EVs on the road, which is great. It's nice to see. But I just felt that, at least in terms of level 3 chargers, it was just not really sufficient in some areas. Like, at least in the like Newark Fremont area, it's like there were probably like 3 EA stations within maybe 5-mile radius, or maybe a little more than that, like 10-mile radius. But you go there and it was like 3 of them work. And then, so maybe like 12 total DC fast chargers in that area. It just like did not seem like didn't seem sufficient at all. Cause like every time you go to the DC fast charger, you'd see a line, and it was just not a great look on the industry. And that can almost be a big hindrance in getting an electric car. If you might live in the Bay and don't have a garage at home where you would level 2 charge your car overnight. So do you see that being an issue in the area as well?
Definitely. So we plug in with a L1, L2 portable unit, in where we park, which is helpful. But through my lease, I also have Electrify America charging, which is fortunate for me, like 10 minutes away.
You got free charging?
I do, yeah, for 2 years, which is a fantastic
Nice.
amenity. And I talk to other drivers frequently who say the same thing, like this helped me make that, purchase decision. It is, really great benefit. But you have to kind of time it, like, okay, not after 5 p.m., not at the lunch hour. And I've definitely waited in line a lot, and it's really frustrating. And then add to that, okay, it's done in 30 minutes and we just sat down to have lunch or dinner, and you're racing back to your car to move it, right? Because you don't want to be billed idle fees, and there's people queuing behind you, kind of waiting for the charger to open up. So those experiences definitely still exist. Most drivers I talk to, that can charge at home, then you're only really fast charging on infrequently or on road trips. So it kind of lessens the anxiety a lot of people feel for fast charging. And I will also say that, because the days of charging infrastructure is still fairly nascent. Like you said, Andrew, like there's maybe one fast charging location, and if a few chargers are out, like you're going to be driving a few miles to find the next one. We've noticed that the charging networks, they're not like gas stations where you're competing with 2 different brands on either side of the street. So pricing tends to vary quite a bit, and experience varies a lot. Moving forward, if you believe that infrastructure starts to look more competitive like the gas station model, they're going to compete on price and most certainly on user experience. So for the networks that the first time a driver visits has a bad time, they're not going to want to come back again. So that's where we see driver support experience being so crucial as this infrastructure, grows in maturity and scale.
Yeah.
A big part of it is consumer education, and to what you said earlier, which is like marketing and branding about the transition, right? I think some people, aside from some of the labels and some of the framing of it, are just can't be bothered with changing their habits or behavior or relearning how to go from a gas pump to electric plug. How do you foresee overcoming that?
Yeah, great question. I know there's a lot of different kind of approaches to educating drivers on electricity as a fuel source and charging. I like to compare it to a smartphone, right? We've all been at the airport or on a plane. It's like, shoot, my phone's going to die. But as long as you're plugged in overnight, most often you're not really stressed about it. And so the more drivers that have an opportunity to charge wherever their car is parked, the easier that becomes. And then kind of once you overcome the initial learning curve, like it's really nice not having to visit gas stations. It's great, driving a really smooth vehicle with, more connected car features. We've noticed that a lot of drivers are educating at a charger. Maybe they rented an EV or they just bought one. They're not going to read all the self-help information or the owner's manual or the FAQs on the charging network website. So when they show up to a station, they're like, yikes, now what? Or, hey, this doesn't look like something I've encountered before. Where's the screen or the card reader? That's where we think like providing support at the station is really important. And in a way that's like specific and accurate and not just, dumping an FAQ document on you. I think some of the ride and drive events I've seen are fantastic. There's a lot of really good organizations around that have kind of helped people like get into a vehicle and experience it. And then to help kind of keep our burn rate at ChargeMate low, I have been putting my EV on Turo. which has kind of helped me pay off some of the financial cost, but it's also been a great way to interact with new drivers. And I see a lot of renters who come to me and they're like, I want to take this for a few days and just get a feel for whether I like it. And that's great, right? It becomes their extended test drive. That's how I kind of started to get an experience of different EVs, was going to dealers and test driving. Turo is also a good option for that.
Wow. So you're a second Turo host on the podcast. So how has your experience been using the platform? And what
I would
vehicles are you
say
renting out? Is it
I'm
the
very
Rivian?
amateur as a Turo host, but I wish I had done this sooner. My previous company, Spring for EV, we were financing vehicles to Turo hosts, and it is a tough business, right? Like the prices are volatile. The pickups and drop offs can be a bit difficult if you don't live really close to an airport. I think the like overall experience I've had though has been people are respectful of the EV. They're excited to try it. And I don't have too many questions about charging. I've never had to deal with someone, running out of battery. I also see probably the majority of renters already have an EV or some other EV model. And so they're kind of familiar already. So it's interesting, that dichotomy of experience with the EV when it comes to Turo.
Yeah, interesting. Because I was always curious about renting out EVs on Turo, just because I always thought that would be an interesting opportunity. Because with some of these cars, like I was thinking Chevy Equinox EV, that's the you can get great deals on those, like up to 10,000 off MSRP once you factor in like tax credit, some of the deals. So you're buying this brand new electric SUV for $25,000, and I think you can finance that at a pretty low rate. So I was like, wonder if I could buy something like that and then lease it or rent it out on Turo. So I was kind of doing some math on that, and it definitely seems interesting. But my only counter argument to using Turo is like right now, like on Hertz or something, if you have like AAA membership, you already get like 30% off. And it is easier objectively to use to use Hertz. Because if you like land in an airport, you can literally just right there. But I do still love Turo, and you can get way more interesting cars. So, but I totally agree. It definitely seems like a tough business to be in.
Yeah. I've had a few renters just in my neighborhood in the Bay Area that I'm, local. And like you said, they're looking to try a specific car. Hertz is consistent, right? I get that. Although I have a bone to pick with Hertz, that the last time I rented an EV from them was a very slow charging Kia Niro.
Ooh,
And I was asked to return the vehicle at the same level of charge that I received
yes.
it, which was 99%. And so when I'm leaving the garage, I was like, excuse me, like, how would I possibly bring this back with 99%? And she's like, oh, don't worry, there's a charger at your airport. You can recharge it. And of course, I'm trying to be a good actor. I don't want to be billed the penalty. But I'm sitting waiting for the last, bit of the charge curve down to maybe like 10 kilowatt hours. Like, it is rough. So I would definitely recommend pay for the option, unlike I did, to kind of bring the car back with below the desired level. I see a lot of people on Turo do that as well because it is, convenient, especially if you're trying to make a flight. But
Well, I think it just goes to show that like those companies haven't really updated their policy or their way of thinking or their business models to reflect a new EV experience, which though in order to do it, I think that is more, customer friendly. I think it would be to have chargers at in that garage, right? Or wherever they're storing them, just have them there so they can charge and just build it into the price so they don't have to see it or deal with it because those cars are parked most of the time. I think it goes
absolutely.
back to like what you were trying to say, which is like make it easy for the users. And I think that's the one thing that Tesla has done really well, which is why they're the leader, which is like they were the first ones to come with the plug and charge. Like this education thing that we were talking about just doesn't exist because stuff just works and you just plug it in. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, trying to put myself in the shoes of a fleet operator, a rental car company, like you've got vehicles coming back at all different times. Some might sit idle for a day or 12 hours where it's a great fit to just charge in the garage. Others, you might need to turn around in a few hours and then you're trying to quickly get it washed and recharged and you need a fast charger. So does that require every Hertz location to have fast chargers on site? Like they don't have the electrical capacity, it's expensive. So there's definitely some challenges there, but I completely agree. We made, EV rental even harder than it needed to be. And yeah, definitely relaxing some of the kind of requirements around charging, um, limit would be helpful. And also renting out EVs that just can charge at a faster rate.
Yeah. See, you were probably lucky in the Nero compared to me in the Subaru Solterra, which is I probably said this like 6 times between all the episodes, so I'll give you the spiel. But this car is one of the slowest charging EVs ever made. So the one I drove, it was like, oh yeah, it has a DC fast charge rate of 100 kilowatts, and it was like I never saw the car do over 40. And I was charging from very low states of charge. There's no way to precondition the battery. Like, do not buy the original Subaru Solterra. I mean, if you're driving like around the neighborhood and you just need a city car, it's fine. But if you like want to go on a decent road trip, don't do the Solterra. But it's like, it's just kind of a thing, just like this old world, like you mentioned, David, way of thinking where it's like, oh yeah, Subaru, they probably make good cars. Their gas cars are fine. And then they go with the Solterra and it's just like an actual brick. And it's really unfortunate that there's some EVs out there that charge poorly. And that's also probably one of the other issues with charging EVs is you have some really great cars. You got the Ioniq 6, you got the Ioniq 5, all the Hyundai EVs, except really for the Niro, which is Kia, and the blanking on the other one, the Kona. Those two. But all the Ioniq vehicles, all the Kia EV6, EV9, great charging vehicles. And then your charging session could be limited by a Subaru Solterra that's just sitting on that charger up to 99 or 100%, but the car doesn't even tell you the state of charge. So the car's just going to be sitting there for a long time. So that's my
Yeah.
little
I mean,
thing.
I wonder how often, Brad, do you have to educate the person on the other side who might be upset at a slow charging speed and just say, I'm sorry, that's just your vehicle, right? Like, it's a Solterra. That's as fast as it's going to go.
Yes.
Or, that's just where you are on the charging curve, right? Like you're at 95%. You're not going to pull any faster because the speeds just reduce. Because I've watched people at EV stations and they're like watching the speed and get like visibly upset when it's not at what they expect it to be. Like, oh, 23 kilowatts, what is this? And it's not
Right.
necessarily a matter of the charging stations, it's a matter of the vehicle, right?
Yeah. We see quite a few conversations with our AI agent at ChargeMate where the driver is asking, how long will it take? Why is my car charging so slowly? And that's when like an AI agent can understand, all right, the charger's rated at 150. You're in a Chevy Bolt. I'm sorry, don't expect to charge any faster than like 45, kilowatt hours. And that is definitely a friction, right? And there's some finger pointing that goes on of like, oh, it's the charger's fault. No, it's the car's fault. So yeah, there's certainly, I think those problems will be solved as new EV models come out, but it creates a very unoptimized experience, and you're like waiting, right, for that driver to kind of move along so someone else in line can charge.
Yeah, there's definitely a big miscommunication with technology in the EV space. I remember I was on an EA station. There's some guy in a Kia EV6. He was complaining to me that it only gets 200 miles of range. And then I asked him, I'm like, well, how fast were you driving? And he said 90 miles per hour. And I'm like, well, there you go. So I would say that is probably the biggest gap, meaning a really significant growth in the EV industry, and it's just education, because there's a lot of people who just don't really know what's going on, I think, to put it nicely. And that is really stemming EV growth. People buying EVs are still people who think that EV batteries only last 5 years. And there's just so many more things. So what do you think is the biggest hurdle in EV growth? Would you also think it's education?
I mean, my perspective is a bit biased because we're trying to solve for charging anxiety. And we feel like it's just the inconsistent experience, not just education and quote user error, but also some of the issues that present themselves with, software and payment and hardware problems. But I do think education is critical, and that comes in various forms. In an ideal world, our EVs are simple and intuitive enough that you get in and it's easy to drive and charge. We know though that getting from a gas station experience to charging and learning how that's a bit different, the idea that you would top off or plug in your garage, or not charged to a full battery. That's very different. But I think most of the time when people have that experience after a few weeks, like it doesn't feel so scary anymore.
Not to necessarily go right there, but I feel like it's warranted, this question. So like Elon's got a pretty significant role and influence, let's say, in the new administration, right? But there has been a lot of what people are deeming as anti-EV stances and actions. Then again, though, Elon's proven that he can do things and execute them well. Like Tesla is still, in my mind, fairly untouchable when it comes to overall EV driver and owner experience out there. And for whatever reason, the competition hasn't been able to figure it out. So, I mean, do you think that Elon's actually trying to hold back the EV industry for his sake? Or is he just saying, hey, I did it. Everyone else should just be able to figure it out too?
Great question, right? Like the analogy that he crossed the bridge to profitable EV and scaled production and now burn it for all the competitors. I mean, that would be really shrewd and maybe on brand, but I'm not sure. I think that the free market economics of like no tax credit, a lot of EVs will compete. It will force auto companies to bring the prices down. Where I have learned over the last few years that the real value in having those tax credits wasn't just to the consumer to lower the upfront cost and hurdle, but really as a signal to all the auto manufacturers. It kind of sends mixed messages when, the largest and most successful, pure EV OEM is kind of anti, some of the subsidies, but I think the industry will survive. We'll see kind of how that shakes out.
Interesting. Now, as we start to wrap up the episode, I would like to just ask you one final question is, where do you see EV growth in the next 4 years, I guess we could say? Do you see it to still be as significant as it was in the early 2020s, or how do you think it's going to play out?
Great question. I think that it will continue, maybe for now at a slower rate of growth. I think you're going to see that accelerate, especially as like EV prices are going to keep coming down. New foreign electric vehicles are also even more and more affordable. We're likely going to see downward pressure on electric rates if the Trump administration starts deregulating the power industry, to a greater extent. And TBD on how oil, and gas prices end up coming out. But all that is to say, I think that it, will accelerate, EV adoption, whether that's full battery electric vehicles or now this kind of middle option of more plug-in hybrids. Certainly next year, I think it's maybe 20-25% of new EVs sold will be some form of an electric powertrain. Great if that's fully battery electric, but there's also really good kind of intermediate options for hybrids.
Nicely said. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. And Brad Crist, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.